When Margaret, a once independent mother, suffers a sudden fall, her three adult children, Emma, Lucas, and Adrian, are forced to confront a family long fractured by old resentments and unspoken sacrifices. Emma, the caretaker, has sacrificed her dreams. Lucas has avoided responsibility. Adrian has fled for freedom. As hidden favoritism, past betrayals, and a shocking secret come to light, the siblings must navigate guilt, anger, and fear to decide who will care for Margaret. Through confrontation, compromise, and reflection, they learn that love and family are messy, flawed, and fragile, but also capable of healing if they face the truth together. Let them. Emma's phone rang like a siren in the middle of the night. Her fingers froze on the screen before she even saw the number. The second ring brought clarity. It was the hospital. Her heart lurched. She grabbed the phone and held it to her ear, the sound of her mother's name shaking through the nurse's voice like a warning bell. Margaret had fallen. Margaret, who had always seemed indestructible, who had baked, cleaned, and fussed over everyone else's life as if hers were a side project. Now she was lying in a hospital bed, fragile, a stark contrast to the mother Emma had known. The image refused to let her breathe. Emma barely remembered how she drove to the hospital. Her mind replayed scenes from childhood, the small victories, the sacrifices, the moments she had given up for this family. She had put her own career on hold, postponed dreams, all to be the reliable one. And now, as she pulled into the hospital parking lot, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling over her shoulders, like a heavy coat. In the waiting room, Lucas and Adrian were already there, a stark reminder of the paths they had chosen. Lucas, the eldest, exuded a quiet authority. He was always calculated, organized, in control. Except now, there was a distance in his eyes, a hesitancy that made Emma's stomach twist. Adrian, the youngest, looked restless, as if the sterile hospital lights and endless ticking of clocks made him uncomfortable, impatient. Margaret's fall was just the surface. Emma knew the real challenge would come after she left the hospital, when the siblings would have to decide what care she deserved, and who would be willing to provide it. Lucas, she knew, would insist he had responsibilities elsewhere. Adrian, she feared, might vanish again, claiming he had too many obligations, or worse, that he didn't want the burden. And Emma herself. Emma felt trapped between the pull of duty and the long-suppressed desire to live her own life. The first hours were a blur. Margaret was examined, assessed, and deemed stable, but incapable of returning to her apartment alone. That simple verdict ignited an invisible fuse. Emma watched her siblings avoid eye contact, each retreating into their own version of practicality. She could almost hear the silent argument already forming between them. Lucas offering financial solutions, Adrian suggesting temporary arrangements, Emma imagining herself doing everything herself. In her mind, she replayed the past. Lucas excelling in his career, barely acknowledging the ways she had kept the family afloat. Adrian leaving home to chase freedom, leaving her to shoulder burdens alone. Margaret, always so proud, but always unknowingly or knowingly playing favorites, leaving invisible marks that shaped their resentment. Each memory was a spark, ready to ignite a confrontation. By the time Margaret was discharged, the plan was vague. A brief conversation about schedules, responsibilities, and options had taken place, but it was more a series of polite deflections than any real decisions. Emma's chest ached with anticipation, the unspoken conflicts pressing against her ribs. She realized that Margaret's fall was not just a physical event. It was a catalyst, a trigger that would expose everything buried in years of compromise, sacrifice, and distance. Driving home, Emma felt the tension in her body. She knew the coming days would demand choices that no one wanted to make, that guilt would shadow every decision, and that old resentments would rise like ghosts from the past. She glanced at the rearview mirror, imagining the reflection of her siblings' faces, each carrying their own version of responsibility, fear, and avoidance. The quiet road seemed too long, too empty, and yet the journey ahead was unavoidable. Emma understood something vital in that moment. The fall was only the beginning. The real struggle would be the silent, relentless tug-of-war between love, duty, resentment, and the harsh truth that family obligations could bind even the closest hearts into knots. And as she drove into the night, the weight of it settled over her like a shadow she could neither shake nor escape. Emma returned home with a tight knot in her chest. Margaret's apartment felt impossibly quiet, the air heavy with the absence of her mother's presence. The emptiness seemed louder than any argument, and yet, in that silence, the weight of responsibility pressed down on her. She knew the real challenge had only just begun. Lucas was the first to speak, though his words were measured, careful, and utterly frustrating. He suggested arrangements, schedules, and financial solutions, each framed as practical and sensible, yet somehow distant, like he was trying to solve a problem that wasn't fully human, that didn't involve emotion, guilt, or memories. Emma felt the familiar spark of resentment flare. He had always been like this, competent, organized, untouchable, and impossible to depend on for anything that required real empathy. Adrian, on the other hand, moved through the room with restless energy, scanning spaces, muttering suggestions, as if he could fix everything by moving quickly enough. His presence was both a relief and a provocation. He had been gone for years, chasing freedom and escaping the control of home, but now he returned and expected to be part of the decision-making, as if absence had absolved him of past responsibilities. Emma's chest tightened. Trusting him felt dangerous, yet ignoring him felt cruel. Emma herself hovered in the middle, stuck between Lucas's order and Adrian's unpredictability. She had already sacrificed so much, her career, her personal ambitions, the life she might have lived if she hadn't stayed behind. But she also carried the guilt of knowing she couldn't do it alone forever. Every glance at the hospital paperwork, every fleeting memory of the long nights she had spent cooking meals, cleaning rooms, or sitting awake in worry, reminded her how much she had given. And yet, the siblings seemed to weigh her effort as if it were expected. Nothing extraordinary at all. The tension was subtle at first. A choice of words here, a hesitated suggestion there, but beneath the surface it was electric, a current of unspoken grievances and decades of patterns. Emma remembered the time Lucas had refused to help with Margaret after her hip surgery, insisting he had more important things to do. She remembered the empty promises Adrian had made when he returned home for holidays, only to disappear again into the world he had chosen over family. And Margaret herself, silent, proud, always slightly manipulative, had shaped these dynamics, unconsciously elevating one child over another, leaving invisible marks that hardened over time. As the day wore on, the siblings' differences became impossible to ignore. Lucas wanted schedules, budgets, and professional care. Adrian suggested rotating shifts, weekend visits, and temporary arrangements, but his voice carried a hesitation that betrayed insecurity, or worse, avoidance. Emma felt her own patience fray. She realized she was the only one who seemed capable of holding everything together, and that realization carried both pride and despair. Emma's mind drifted, recalling the long nights she had spent keeping the household afloat, quietly stepping into roles no one else wanted, sacrificing moments of personal freedom for the sake of the family. She wondered whether any of it had mattered, or whether it had been invisible all along. She thought about the resentment simmering beneath the surface, about how easily it might explode if she didn't carefully navigate the next steps. By evening, a tentative plan had emerged, but it was fragile, more a compromise of avoidance than a real solution. Margaret would return home, temporarily assisted by professional caregivers, and the siblings would rotate responsibilities in theory. In practice, Emma knew it would be chaos. She felt the strain already, a tension coiling through her chest. The siblings left for the night, and the apartment felt impossibly quiet again, a space waiting to witness the next wave of conflict. Emma sat alone, reflecting on the delicate balance she had to maintain. The coming days would demand choices, and each choice would carry the weight of guilt, resentment, and responsibility. She understood now that this wasn't just about caring for Margaret. It was about confronting every hidden wound, every past sacrifice, every unspoken expectation, and the fragile web of love and resentment that had defined their family for decades. And as she closed her eyes that night, exhaustion and anxiety mingling, she realized that the fall was only the beginning. The real struggle would be in the unspoken divisions, the silent accusations, and the hard, unavoidable task of facing the past while trying to preserve a family that seemed determined to fracture. The following morning, Emma woke to the quiet hum of Margaret's apartment. The sunlight spilled across the floor, but it did little to warm the heaviness in her chest. Today would be another test. A confrontation disguised as routine, a day where the undercurrents of resentment might surface in subtle, sharp ways. Lucas arrived first, carrying a briefcase and the air of calm efficiency that always irritated Emma. He set about organizing Margaret's medications, charting schedules, and making lists, as if the very act of writing it down could solve the emotional complexity swirling between them. Emma watched him, half in admiration and half in frustration. He was capable, yes, but cold, detached, like the world had to be managed rather than lived. Adrian came later, moving with restless energy, shifting chairs, adjusting blankets, opening cupboards, all while glancing at the clock. He suggested ideas quickly, often abandoning them before they could fully materialize. Emma felt a flicker of exasperation. It was the same pattern he had followed his entire life. Leaving when things became uncomfortable, returning only when convenient. She knew his heart might be in the right place, but his timing always undermined trust. Margaret sat in her chair, fragile and alert, observing them all with quiet intensity. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of pride and mischief, that reminded Emma how subtly her mother had shaped the dynamics of the family. Margaret's favoritism had never been blatant, never words spoken aloud, but it existed in actions, in glances, in who she relied on during crises. Emma remembered the long nights she had spent caring for her siblings, for Margaret, often unnoticed. And now, Lucas and Adrian's presence brought those memories forward, fresh and sharp, like unhealed scars reopening. The morning progressed with careful movements, but tensions simmered beneath the surface. Emma caught herself clenching her jaw at Lucas's quiet superiority, feeling the old anger rise. Adrian's restless energy made her skin crawl, a reminder of the unpredictability she had spent years managing. Each small action, the way Lucas arranged the medications, the way Adrian fussed without finishing tasks, became a symbol of all the unspoken grievances between them. Emma reflected on the past, on the invisible debt of sacrifice she had carried. She had given up promotions, travel opportunities, even friendships to stay close, to support Margaret and manage the household. She had counted on her siblings to share responsibility, but they had often prioritized their own ambitions, leaving her to bear burdens alone. The thought twisted inside her chest. Was this care for Margaret a reward, or another expectation piled on top of years of unnoticed labor? Lucas, oblivious to her simmering anger, finally suggested a schedule for the coming week. Emma agreed outwardly, but internally she bristled. She knew this plan was a compromise designed to avoid conflict, not resolve it. Adrian nodded half-heartedly, making casual suggestions that no one fully listened to, a quiet rebellion against structure. Margaret's presence added a layer of complexity. She moved with fragile dignity, observing their actions, occasionally commenting in ways that reminded Emma of childhood lessons, subtle manipulations, and invisible comparisons. Emma realized how much their mother's influence had shaped their relationships, not just with her, but with each other. Old wounds formed by favoritism, neglect, and misunderstood intentions had never truly healed. By afternoon, the tension became almost tangible. Emma caught herself holding her breath while Lucas adjusted Margaret's chair. Adrian's fidgeting created a quiet irritation that built into an almost physical weight pressing on her chest. Margaret's soft admonitions and pointed remarks reminded them all of how easily small words could wound, how every interaction carried echoes of past disputes. Emma felt the strain of holding everything together, the physical care, the planning, the emotional balance, while managing her own internal storms of resentment and guilt. She realized the fractures in the family ran deeper than this moment. The fall had merely exposed them. The old wounds, now raw, demanded acknowledgement. By evening, the siblings parted reluctantly, each carrying their private burdens, each retreating to their own space. Emma lingered, looking around the apartment, feeling the weight of history pressing down on her. She understood, painfully, that the coming days would force them to confront not only the practical challenges of care, but also the long-standing emotional fractures that had defined their family for decades. And in that quiet apartment, with Margaret asleep in her chair, Emma allowed herself a moment to grieve, not just for her mother's vulnerability, but for the family she had inherited, fractured, complicated, and undeniably human. The day started quietly, almost deceptively calm. Margaret sat in her favorite armchair, hands folded, observing the room with an intensity that made Emma's stomach tighten. Something was coming. Emma could feel it. A revelation that would tear through the fragile threads holding the family together. It began subtly. Margaret cleared her throat and, with careful words, hinted at the past she had kept hidden. She spoke of a financial decision, a choice she had made years ago that had quietly shaped their lives. Emma felt a chill. She had always assumed responsibility had been shared fairly, that sacrifices had been equally distributed. But now those assumptions were unraveling. Lucas stiffened, his composure faltering for the first time in years. The truth was more than a detail. It was a weight, a moral debt he hadn't known existed. He had believed his career-driven choices and avoidance of domestic care had been neutral, even justified. Now he realized Margaret had relied on Emma far more than he had imagined, and in doing so, had shielded him. Adrian's reaction was subtler but no less intense. His restless movements slowed, his usual fidgeting replaced by a quiet tension. He felt a mix of relief and guilt. Relief that some of the responsibility he had avoided fell elsewhere, guilt that he hadn't recognized it sooner. The layers of resentment he had carried, toward Emma for staying, toward Lucas for being distant, toward Margaret for manipulation, shifted in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. Emma's own mind raced. The secret was not simply financial. It revealed Margaret's biases, the invisible favoritism she had shown, and the sacrifices she had expected without acknowledgement. Emma realized that the life she had lived, the choices she had made, the career she had put aside, the sleepless nights and emotional labor had been influenced by forces she had never fully understood. The anger that surged through her was mixed with clarity. She now saw the reasons behind patterns she had thought were personal failings. Margaret's confession continued, revealing more. A moment in the past where she had intervened on Lucas's behalf, a protective decision that had left Emma with greater burdens, and a small financial mismanagement that had shaped Adrian's early independence. Each revelation was a strike against the illusion of fairness that had kept the family functioning. Each strike was a blow to trust, yet also an invitation to understanding. The room, once filled with subtle, unspoken tension, now felt heavy with the weight of truth. Lucas's carefully maintained detachment cracked. Adrian's restless energy settled into introspection. Emma's anger and resentment coexisted with a strange sense of vindication. The past, which had always been an unspoken battlefield, was now open, raw, and undeniable. For a moment, silence took hold. Margaret looked at each child, her expression weary but expectant, as if she had known this moment would arrive for years. The revelation had done its work. Old patterns, old wounds, and unspoken sacrifices now lay bare. The siblings were forced to see not only each other, but also themselves in a new light. Emma recognized the complicated mix of emotions rising in her chest. Anger still lingered, but it was tempered by understanding. Lucas's guilt, once invisible, became visible. Adrian's defensiveness softened. Margaret's humanity, the flaws, the intentions, and the errors, became undeniable. The secret had not solved anything, but it had opened a path toward clarity, a way for the siblings to confront decades of miscommunication, misunderstanding, and hidden resentment. By the end of the day, the siblings left the apartment with a fragile, unspoken acknowledgement. The world had shifted. The past could not be erased, and the sacrifices, resentments, and choices of years could not be undone. But the revelation had offered perspective. Each sibling, in their own private thoughts, began the slow process of understanding, not just their mother, but each other and themselves. Emma lingered for a moment, looking at Margaret, who returned to her chair, quiet but steady. She realized that while the secret had shaken the family to its core, it had also cleared the air. The unspoken tensions had been given a voice, and the work of reconciliation, messy, emotional, and fragile, was now possible. The battle was no longer hidden. It had been acknowledged, and in acknowledgement, a fragile seed of healing had been planted. The apartment felt smaller than ever. The morning light streamed through the windows, but it did nothing to soften the atmosphere. Emma, Lucas, and Adrian had gathered with Margaret seated in her chair, the center of their shared concern and silent tension. Every movement, every glance carried unspoken judgments, unspoken histories, and the weight of yesterday's revelations. Lucas was first to speak, but his words were measured, clinical, and distant. He outlined a plan for care, emphasizing schedules, professional help, and financial logistics. On the surface, it seemed reasonable, responsible even. But Emma sensed the detachment in every suggestion, the subtle avoidance of real emotional involvement. He had always been capable, but capable in a way that distanced him from responsibility, leaving her and Adrian to navigate the real burden of care. Adrian fidgeted, offering suggestions of his own, some tentative, some impulsive, all betraying a desire to help without truly committing. He shifted from chair to chair, moving through the space as though he could escape the tension if he kept moving. Emma could see the guilt in his eyes, the understanding that he had abandoned responsibilities in the past, but also the fear that stepping fully into the present would make him vulnerable in ways he wasn't prepared to handle. Emma, standing between them, felt the familiar coil of responsibility tighten in her chest. She had carried so much already, the care, the emotional labor, the quiet sacrifices, but now she had to negotiate compromise with siblings who had always been unpredictable in their commitment. She realized that the confrontation would not be about the logistics alone. It would be about confronting decades of resentment, unspoken judgments, and the fragile fabric of their family. Margaret, though fragile, seemed to sense the unspoken dynamics, her eyes moving between them, noting every hesitation, every expression. She had survived years of managing her own children's personalities, subtle manipulations, and unbalanced expectations. Now she watched as her own past choices collided with the present, forcing her children to negotiate care in a space fraught with old tensions. The conversation, or what passed for conversation, was tense, quiet at times, explosive at others. Lucas emphasized responsibility but skirted the emotional labor. Adrian offered help but withdrew whenever pressure mounted. Emma pushed, holding space for both care and confrontation, unwilling to let compromise mask the deep truths. Each suggestion carried layers of unspoken meaning. Each refusal or acceptance was colored by decades of unacknowledged sacrifice and latent resentment. Emma's mind moved through the years. Sleepless nights when she had carried the household alone, weekends spent supporting Margaret while Lucas pursued his career, Adrian's absence leaving her with unshared burdens. She realized the confrontation was bigger than the immediate task. It was the culmination of a lifetime of imbalance, expectation, and misaligned priorities. By mid-afternoon, emotions reached a peak. The siblings were raw, defensive, and exhausted. Each felt the pull of duty, guilt, and resentment simultaneously. And yet, they could not ignore the reality of Margaret's needs. The apartment felt like a battlefield, a charged arena where past grievances met current obligations. Slowly, painfully, a fragile compromise emerged. Margaret would receive professional care, supplemented by a rotation of visits from Lucas, Adrian, and Emma. Responsibilities would be shared more equitably than before, though not perfectly, and each sibling would confront their own role in the history of neglect, favoritism, and sacrifice. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a start, a way forward that acknowledged the past while providing structure for the present. Emma felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The confrontation had not solved everything. Resentment still lingered. Old wounds still throbbed beneath the surface. But for the first time, there was a sense of clarity, an acknowledgement that the struggle for care was not just about logistics. It was about fairness, responsibility, and the complicated web of love, guilt, and history that defined their family. As the day ended, Emma looked at Margaret, whose quiet observation seemed both satisfied and sorrowful. The confrontation had been necessary, and the compromise imperfect, but it had forced the siblings to face truths they could no longer ignore. And in that shared acknowledgement, Emma felt the faintest stirrings of hope. Perhaps the fractures of the past could slowly begin to mend. Days passed with quiet routines and subtle adjustments. Margaret settled into her care schedule, professional helpers moving through the apartment with efficient competence. Lucas visited regularly, his presence less distant, more measured, though he still carried the weight of his past detachment. Adrian appeared sporadically, sometimes restless, sometimes deeply reflective, his gestures hinting at newfound responsibility. And Emma moved through it all like a tightrope walker, balancing care, resentment, and hope, learning that compromise was as much about inner adjustment as it was about external arrangements. The apartment felt different now. No longer an arena of simmering tension, it had become a space where care and cooperation coexisted with lingering imperfections. Emma noticed small moments that had been absent for years. Lucas offering a gentle hand when Margaret needed support, Adrian staying longer than planned to help with chores, Margaret smiling without the weight of hidden expectations pressing on her. The changes were subtle, but they were real. Emma reflected on the journey. The fall, the arguments, the revelations, they had all been catalysts, forces that forced truth to the surface. She realized that family was not about perfect alignment or flawless support. It was about navigating flaws, confronting history, and holding space for one another despite imperfections. She thought of her sacrifices, of the nights she had been alone in responsibility, and for the first time she allowed herself a sense of quiet pride. She had endured, but she had also grown, learning patience, empathy, and the limits of control. Lucas, too, was quietly transformed. The acknowledgement of Margaret's secret and the confrontation of old patterns forced him to confront his own avoidance. He recognized the ways he had relied on Emma, the subtle abdication of responsibility, and the consequences of prioritizing career over family. Though he still carried remnants of guilt, he had begun the slow process of genuine engagement, showing that competence alone was not enough. Emotional presence mattered. Adrian's growth was messier, more tentative. He had to confront not just guilt for past absence, but fear of repeating patterns. His restlessness persisted, but he began to understand the value of commitment, the weight of consistency, and the ways small gestures of care could ripple through a family's life. For Adrian, learning to stay was as important as learning to help. Margaret observed them all with quiet satisfaction. She understood that her children were flawed, human, and sometimes slow to learn, but they were learning. Her secret had shaken the family, yes, but it had also opened a door, an opportunity for understanding, empathy, and connection. She felt a mixture of relief and sorrow, knowing that she could no longer fully shape their lives, but that she could bear witness to their growth and efforts. Emma paused one evening, watching her siblings prepare a shared meal for Margaret. The atmosphere was calm, even tender. Arguments had not vanished entirely, but they no longer dominated interactions. The quiet compromises, the shared care, and the mutual acknowledgement of past mistakes created a fragile harmony. She realized that healing did not mean perfection. It meant recognition, effort, and the willingness to move forward despite lingering fractures. The experience reshaped Emma's understanding of family. Love was not always gentle. Responsibility was rarely simple. Resentment was a shadow that never fully disappeared. Yet within that complexity lay resilience, the possibility of repair, and the beauty of imperfect connections. She had learned that caring for someone was as much about emotional presence as physical assistance, and that the bonds of family were strengthened not by avoidance of conflict, but by facing it openly, honestly, and with willingness to forgive. As night fell, Emma sat quietly beside Margaret's chair, watching the soft rise and fall of her mother's chest. The apartment felt lived in, warm, and alive, not because the family had achieved perfection, but because they had chosen presence over avoidance, action over indifference, and understanding over judgment. The fractures of the past were still there, faint and persistent, but they no longer defined the family. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, letting the calm wash over her. The struggle had been exhausting, painful, and complicated, but it had also brought clarity, connection, and a fragile sense of peace. In the quiet reflection of the evening, she allowed herself to hope. Not for a perfect family, but for a family capable of growth, empathy, and shared care, navigating the challenges of life together, imperfectly, yet sincerely. The journey was not over. There would be more challenges, more arguments, more adjustments. But for the first time, Emma felt ready to face them, knowing that even in imperfection, love and responsibility could coexist, and that sometimes surviving the fractures was the only path to true connection. Thanks for listening. Hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe.